in vrnila sem mu pogled. Čutila sem, da mu bo vsak čas razneslo srce. Charles, sem pomislila, lezi no spet poleg mene. Lahko bi se smejala in se dotikala. Lahko bi molčala in se obenem pogrešala. Priprl je oči, nosnice so mu zaplapolale, preklel me s samimi sočnimi besedami. Plamen sveče na okenski polici je poplesaval naprej, povsem neprizadet od pravkaršnjega dogajanja. Sploh ne vem več, kaj je bolečina. Udarjen komolec, strto srce, pekočina v zadnjiku. Vse to bi pomenilo, da mi moje telo resnično pripada. Ampak kakšna čudna misel je to. Niti mamine zapestnice ni več. Lastnina Rajha. Tako kot tudi jaz. Nič več mi ne pripada.
All right, so good evening, everyone. As I was reading the book Ada's Realm, which was translated by Sarah Virk, I kept thinking about the connection between seemingly separate geographical and historical dimensions. In an experimental, yet carefully thought out form of storytelling, the book tells the story of Ada, or Adas, who, within various scenarios, contemplates the completeness and non-linear connections of global temporality. In the 15th century, with the arrival of Portuguese colonizer, we meet Ada in the coastal area of today's Ghana, where she mourns the death of a newborn. Ada, whose characterization is based on the biography of the brilliant mathematician Ada Lovelace, is then again found in Victorian London in 1848, where she has a secret affair with the writer Charles Dickens. We encounter Ada again in 1945 during Nazi Germany in the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, where she is forced into prostitution. The last Ada A young African woman who is pregnant is later on found in Berlin in 2019 during the Brexit era Europe, where she has come from from Ghana, to study. All versions of others, which can be read as the story of multiple women or just one, are part of a larger plan connected by a kind of a spirit, commanded by God, and most importantly, connected with a bracelet, which holds a central purpose in the book. I feel privileged to be able to talk tonight with the author of the book, Sharon Dodua Otoo, whose work has completely captivated me. Sharon Dodua Otoo was born in the UK to a Ghanaian family, and early in her teenage years, she discovered her affinity for the German language, in which she also wrote the book Ada's Realm, actually Ada's Realm. She's a prominent social activist and writer based in Germany. In 2016, her short story, Herr Grotprut Sits Down, won the Ingeborg-Bachmann-Preises, one of the Germany's highest literary honors. Ada's Realm was published in 2021 with a Slovene translation titled Adina, soba. Since today's conversation is going to be held in English, I suggest we use the English version of the title, Ada's Realm, or
Room.
Ada's Room, yeah. Okay. So, Sharon Dodua Otoo, welcome to Ljubljana and welcome to Fabula. I'm again really happy to talk to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Perhaps we should start with somehow banal, ordinary question, but I believe it's very essential. So, what inspired your writing, and specifically, what inspired the idea of multiple Adas?
Oh, so that's two questions in one.
Questions in one.
For the price of one. Okay, can I quickly, before then I answer the question, just to say thank you for the warm welcome and for the organization and for everyone to this reading this evening. It's kind of surreal for me that, this book that I worked on for such a long time ago, it was published in 2021 in Germany, is now fresh and new in Slovene version, and I'm really excited about this opportunity. And the question was how I came to writing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Writing has always been quite important for me. I think it's one of the few ways people can, on their own, you don't need very much, a piece of paper and a pen, and you can work through some things that you're going through. You can have a self-monologue, you can discuss things, you're not going to be interrupted by anybody else. And then sometimes, if you're really lucky, something beautiful comes out of what you've written. If it's a poem or a song or a short story, which I used to write a lot of, then you can share it with others. And sometimes when you're writing, the things that you've captured on paper mean something to someone else because you've kind of found that exact word or sentence that somehow captures an experience that they also have had. So I've always found writing very important for me, for processing what it means to be living my life at this time, with the family I had, with the friends that I had, and the things that were important to me while I was growing up. I've been writing for a long time. And when I had the opportunity to write this book, as you've already mentioned, I'd written a short story called Herr Grotrup Sits Down or Takes a Seat. There's also two translations of that story. And in that story, I had been working through ideas of privilege. Privilege simply means what it's like to be somebody who goes through life and certain things are easier for you because of who you are that would be very difficult for somebody else. So, for example, I guess most of us do not need to use a wheelchair, right? So when I'm invited to a reading, I don't have to think about, I have to plan how I'm going to get to the airport and ask the airline if they'll take I just take it for granted that I can come to a reading and everything fits, everything's fine for me. And not everybody has that experience. And I was asked to write a story about white privilege, which is the feeling of passing through life when you're a white person in a predominantly white society, that there are certain things that you don't have to think about because it's just normal. And in the short story, I kind of used humor and satire to think about that. And when that story won the prize, which was completely a surprise for me, I had then the opportunity to develop that story into a novel. That's how the idea first came around. And in the short story, there's a figure called Ada, who's a cleaning lady and very, very unassuming. And in the novel, I expanded. It was already alluded to in the short story that she was a very important person and had knowledge that had been generated over centuries. And so in the novel, I get a chance to explain what I mean by that. And then that's how I came up with the multiple Adas.
Okay. So your book, as I have already mentioned, draws from certain historical facts that you incorporate into fiction. And you cover, let's say, West Africa and slavery, and then Victorian England and the Irish Great Famine and Nazi labor camp, and then just contemporary racism in Europe. And you also draw from biographies of real people.
Yes.
Even, I think, African Mansa Musa, right?
Yeah, Mansa Musa gets a mention, yeah.
I really love that. Yeah. So my question is, how much research this method of writing require?
That's a good question. I did do a lot of research, but not because, so this book isn't a historical novel. I didn't aim to write something that was completely historical accurate. So anybody who gets to the part about Ada Lovelace and Charles Dickens will realize that was completely fictional. Yeah. I just liked the idea.
Actually, I was Googling it.
Yeah. And did you find anything?
No.
Good.
But they know each other. Yeah.
They knew each other. They did hang out. But, you know, the thing about that story was, for me, important because at the time when I was writing, Ada Lovelace wasn't really a name that many people had heard of and didn't understand her contribution to science and computers and programming. So it was a question to me, how comes that this brilliant woman lived in the 19th century and hardly anyone knows her name today, apart from some very talented mathematicians and computer scientists, many maybe are sitting here today. How comes hardly everyone's heard of this woman, Ada Lovelace, but everybody knows who Charles Dickens is? I've never met someone who doesn't know who Charles Dickens is. And then I did know that Ada Lovelace had some extramarital affairs. And I did know that Charles Dickens had also had some extramarital affairs. I thought, well, you know, wouldn't it be interesting to think about what it would have been like if they had been together? And when I was writing this scene, I had a lot of fun with it because Charles Dickens in my book is, he takes on characteristics that you might think to be typically, if you think in these terms, typically feminine, right? He's very upset because he's not taken seriously, and why does she think she knows more than him? And his art is the most important of all, and she's kind of very cool. Was that me? She's kind of very sorry about that. She's kind of very cool and rational, and kind of doesn't take him too seriously, and that makes him even more frustrated. So I had a lot of fun playing with these two figures. And the idea wasn't to present a historical fact, but my idea was thinking through what would it mean to be a woman, or to be, it's even more complicated than that. What would it mean to be a person living in the 19th century who is made to become a woman? So I'm thinking that gender is something that is kind of a performance. And in some ways you create yourself as a woman, but in some ways you're forced into this corset of being a woman. And Ada Lovelace was someone who I've already said was quite brilliant. And if she had been performing as a man, she'd be allowed to be a man, then she would probably have gone down in history. And she would definitely be mentioned alongside all the other very important mathematicians of the time. But she lived at a time when women were not even allowed to go to the library. For example, she had to send her husband to the library to borrow the books for her. And I just thought about that. And I thought about how a woman like that, with this massive talent and intelligence, has to pretend to somehow not be, you know, in order to navigate Charles Dickens' ego, she has to kind of pretend to be a bit demure and, you know, not say too much and not answer back too much. And that's kind of a performance that many women do in professional contexts, right? They have to know how to navigate male ego. Sorry, I don't want to offend anybody, but women have these secrets, right? Where they have to try to navigate male egos and you know, imagine being somebody who works in the current US administration. You've got to know how to manage this ego. I'm not mentioning names, as I said. So I wanted to think through that, and the part that was important about me using the historical figure of Ada Lovelace was I wanted to write about a woman who has this extraordinary talent. And there were many women, actually, in the 19th century. Ada Lovelace's mother was also an extraordinary talent mathematically, and the people that she chose to teach her daughter were also brilliant, but we don't know their names, or many people don't know their names. I don't remember the names right now off by heart. If I had just written a book and it was a fictional character who was a mathematical genius living in the 19th century, I think that wouldn't have been so easy for people to accept. They would have read it and go, oh yeah, Sharon's trying to make a political point about how clever women are. But I want to say, no, this woman actually really lived. And when people then look at her up and think, oh, that's interesting, there was this person, she did have these achievements. That was more why I used this historical name.
But you just said that you don't see your book as historical, but I feel there is some space for correcting historical narratives, such as this one.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's also about how history tends to be told. And while I was writing, I was thinking a lot about how history tends to be told in separate chunks, right? You've got European history, 19th century, or you got West African history, and you've got this history and that. And I understand the concept of breaking things off into parts and then focusing on those parts. I do that, of course, myself. But I wanted to explore in this novel how actually I conceive of history as being much more complicated than that. And also history not necessarily being a straight line where one thing happened then, all that time ago, prehistoric, and it's primitive, and we're over that now because we're much better in the modern day. And in the future, it's going to be even shinier and even faster and even more technological advanced. I wanted to think about history. I used the image of the infinity sign. So it's not a circle that just keeps going round and round and we don't get anywhere, but it's a movement that goes back round, but we have the possibility to transform. So we experience challenges again and again, but we have another go at trying to get even better at navigating those challenges. That was my idea. So I do look at things that happened in history, but like I said, it would be a shame. I heard of a reader who had read my book and then was really disappointed that Ada Lovelace and Charles Dickens hadn't had an affair. And I was kind of angry with me because I'd lied, you know. And I wouldn't want that to be the experience, you know, that the readers think I'm lying to them. That's not the point. It's more of an experiment and, you know, what would happen if, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But you're still, I mean, like, you know, balancing the art of literature and historical accuracy, at least.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And I really like how you give a voice to those who are often excluded from the historical canon. And I suggest we now hear an excerpt from the book, interpreted by actress Ana Pavlin. The excerpt captures Ada's thoughts in the concentration camp. So, Ana, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Konštajn pri Nordhausnu. Marec 1945. In potem je izginila. Sploh ne vem več, kaj je bolečina. Udarjen komolec, strto srce, pekočina v zadnjiku. Vse to bi pomenilo, da mi moje telo resnično pripada. Ampak kakšna čudna misel je to. Le kaj naj z njo. Znakov, da bi lahko na svet spravila novo življenje, ni več. Kot da bi me vštevala lastna maternica. Nič se ne paziš. Preteklost se zgubila, sedanjost so te ukradli. Pejdem zdaj in vzamem s sabo še tvojo prihodnost. Niti mamine zapestnice ni več. Lastnina Rajha. Tako kot tudi jaz. Nič več mi ne pripada. V tej zbirki trenutkov se največkrat zatečem v rdečkast, lebdeč prostor za svojimi vekami. Od tam lahko opazujem dogajanje z nekakšne znanstvene distance. Lahko, čeprav nočem. Tega nikoli nočem. Če se zgodi po noči in smem obraz obrniti proti oknu, mi pogostoma uspe priti vse do lune. Tam malce postanem, lahkih nog odskakljam naokrog in radovedno poližem tla. Okus bi imela po sladkorju v prahu. Čudovito. Če se zgodi ob ranem jutru in smem imeti spuščene lase, stresam z glavo in si predstavljam, da so neskončno dolgi in pepelnato svetli. Imeli bi vonj po češnjevcih in sivki, sanjsko. Ob popoldnevih postanem atletinja in tečem hitreje od svetlobne hitrosti. Übermensch, bi se veselili, če bi bila Arika. Možača, bi se zgražali, če bi bila Afričanka. Ob večerih, ko so srečanja razdeljena na 15-minutne intervale in lahko trajajo največ 2 uri skupaj, si izmišljujem kuharske recepte. Kulinarične stvaritve s šparglji v poletnem času ali pa z lisičkami, če temperature nakazujejo jesen. To bom povedala medvedku, pomislim. Saj si z Linde radi izmenjujeva recepte. Čeprav se skoraj da ne moreva zrediti, me kliče debeluška. Jaz pa njo medvedek. Dovolim si gojiti taka čustva, ker brez nje ne bi preživela niti dneva več v 37. Drugih občutkov niti nimam. Zato lahko kakšen od črtastih stoji v moji sobi, ne da bi se spraševala, kako dolgo ali sploh kako. Fenomenalno. Prihajajo na vsakih 15 minut, jaz pa tega niti ne opazim. Tale ni videti starejši od 16. Še bolj droben je od mene in to mi da misliti. Vidim ga, kako poleti skozi sobo. Z odtisom stopala na zadnjici. Pest bi mu zdrobila že tako ali tako kriv nos. Nohti bi pordečeli od tega. Razpokane ustnice bi se počasi razširile po obrazu, medtem ko bi se dlani ovile okoli njegovega vratu, tesneje. Med svojim klastanjem za zrakom bi gledal ustnice in čisto na koncu bi zaslišal rezek, neskončen smeh. Vse to bi opazovala iz neposredne bližine. Goreče bi si želela, da bi si za to lepo usmrtitev povrnila zmožnost občutenja dotika. Sedem na rob postelje. Opazim, da je on še zmerom dovzeten za bolečino. Samo zato ga nagovorim. Imena imamo za vas, mu šepnem, medtem ko si hlastno razvezuje hlače. Saj ima samo 15 minut, v tem hipu morda le še 13. Imena imamo za vas. To bi vas morda presenetilo. Tudi mi znamo šteti. Penis mu zdaj žalostno in osramočeno obvisi med nogami. Le kaj počne tam, pomislim. Moral bi biti med temi nogami. Razširim ustrezne telesne predele, penis se navzburi in 15 minut je skoraj naokoli. Črtasti je zapadel okrog razglabljan. Storilec ali žrtev? Torej storilec? Čeprav sem vsekakor večja žrtev od nje. Ali pač ne? Poznam ta pogled. Pomislim. takšna strašna žrtev, pa spet ne moreš biti, če ti tvoj tič še vedno pripada. In ker sama nimam več lastnine, ne morem imeti niti mnenja, samo še opazujem lahko. Niti žrtev, niti storilec, niti dober, niti slab, niti mož, niti otrok, niti nič.
Yeah, I believe we can agree that all versions of Adas encounter different aspects of oppression. And in doing so, they also reflect some kind of collective experience of women throughout the history. And I must say that I really liked how you portray them beyond their traumas. Like, you know, as we could hear now, Ada is actually, although she's a victim, like, you know, she's in concentration camp, no doubt about that, but she's still able to think about cooking recipes. And I think this is, you know, she maintained at least a little bit of dignity in a situation that intends to take her dignity away.
Yeah.
And can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah. The cooking recipes, actually, when we're talking about things that are based on history, that also I did take from people, what they're called, survivors or survivors' testimonies, where they talked about one of the ways that they retain their humanity is thinking through things like their favorite recipes. And even though they're starving, the thought about cooking and creating new recipes, you know, and exchanging recipes as a way for them to nourish themselves in all senses of the word. So, yeah, I also wanted to talk a little bit about that extract that we just heard, because there's two words that I recognized.
Okay.
One of them being Übermensch, and then I knew that somehow the word African is in there somewhere. When I was writing this book, I was given a scholarship, which is issued every 2 years. A writer is chosen to write a book that is somehow encapsulating the mood, the feeling of a specific year, of the year that they get the scholarship in, actually. And so while it took me 5 years to write Ada's Raum, and I got one scholarship from the German Literature Fund, but I got a second scholarship to write something about the year 2019. So that's the book was always going to have a present day level, and 2019 was partly also chosen because I had this scholarship. And what I had done is I'd already written the historical parts, or I'd developed them quite far, and I was writing, obviously, this present day experience with 2019, thinking about Brexit, for example. But I then went back to look at the historical parts and try to think about how things that happened in the past also brought up themes that were relevant for 2019. And that section where I talk about Ada dreaming that she would be somewhere else, so she's not experiencing this terrible thing that's actually happening to her. She talks about the fact that if she had been if she'd been German and she was running, and if she'd been German, she'd be praised and she'd be called Übermensch, because this is the Nazi philosophy of how great Germans are. But if she'd been an African, she'd be called, oh gosh, what was that word again? There's a different word. I have forgotten it. But the reason I chose that word was because in 2019 there was an athlete called Caster Semenya, and she had just been told that she was not allowed to participate in the Olympics because apparently she had too much testosterone. In German, I use the word man vibe. I can't remember what the word is translated into English, but it's just like they doubted her femininity, and they said that because she had so much testosterone, she could not race with women. And so that's one of the ways in which I was able to insert themes of 2019 into the historical parts.
How about the characterization of Adas that overcome their situation? I mean, even in other versions.
Other versions. So it was important to me to talk about, it was always going to be a book that talked about trauma. My subject at the time when I was writing, I thought a lot about history, and I thought a lot about how traumatic events in the history, both on a societal level and on a personal level, how do we deal with these? I was always going to be doing that in my novel, but I didn't want to write about victims. That was very important to me. I had the feeling that often when my writing was being read at the time, or things I was saying, if I was talking about discrimination, because I was a public figure, all of a sudden when I won this prize, I would talk about discrimination, I'd talk about feminism, I'd talk about racism, and I had the feeling, or even just identifying as black, using this vocabulary, it was being heard as if I was saying, because I'm calling myself black, I'm talking about all the negative things I experience and I want people to feel sorry for me. And that's actually not what I was saying at all. For me, black is a political self-definition which describes, I mean, for me, it's a similar thing to describing myself as British. I come from somewhere, I've experienced something, I have other people in my life who've experienced similar things, so other black people I would talk to and we'd describe to each other how we mastered different events of the day or different difficult experiences. I will have a specific access to other literature by black people, other art by black people, paintings. I was blown away, by the way, by Kendrick Lamar's performance. I'm like, oh, wow. You know, so there's so many things that I mean when I identify as black that don't have to do with, oh, somebody called me a racist name. That's not it at all. So it was really important to me to write this book and, yes, to talk about the hardships of this experience of being made to be a woman or being made to be feminine, being forced to act in a certain way in the patriarchy. But it was also important to show the joy that comes along with being a woman, or the joy that comes along with being a black person, and the joy that comes along with finding clever ways to resist if, you know, your society is telling you that you should actually be suffering and you're like, no, I'm all right, you know, I'm finding my way. So it was important to me to show these realities, but also to show that these characters that I'm writing are actually resilient. And they're not only good. You know, Ada Lovelace is also a character, for example, who is a lady. She has class privilege. She's English at a time when there's the Irish potato famine. The English people are in government and they should have done something, if not to prevent the famine, definitely to stop it earlier than they did. And that's something I think about, because I think I grew up in the English school system and I didn't learn anything about it in school. And what does it mean? You know, that was very, very relevant to the Brexit time even, because the decision that was taken, which I will always be furious about, the decision that was taken to put this Brexit vote to the referendum highlighted how utterly poor our education system was in terms of our own history in Britain, because it meant that the division that is in Ireland, between the country of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is still part of the UK, this division just flared up again. And one of the politicians in England basically brought up the Irish potato famine again as a threat. It's like, if the island doesn't go along with our plans, then we'll leave them to themselves and they can experience another famine. This was horrible, you know. And I think that kind of language and behavior was possible because we had not taught this much in schools. Yeah.
But speaking about traumatic experience, the book begins with the death of the child, which I believe is a very strong opening.
Yeah.
And it ends with the birth of a child. And overall, Ada's realm explored the wider theme of motherhood or motherhoods.
Was that a spoiler, by the way? Sorry.
Yeah, maybe. But my question is not going in that direction to spoil the joy of reading. But there is a loss of child, but also the death of a mother, right? And absence of mother, and replacements of mother in the form of aunts. And Yeah, you have touched a very sensitive topic here. And was that your purpose? Because I think this spoke to me the most.
The birth
the
and
death of the mother, the death of the child. And I felt like, if the book begins with the death of the child, I mean, like,
where can you go from there?
Where can we go? I mean, like, where can we go further, right?
Yeah, I write like that. I choose first sentences, it's my aim to draw readers in with a first sentence. That means you have to make a commitment. Okay, I'm going to read this. And so that was the birth of the child. The death of a child right at the beginning of the book was a statement about what you're letting yourself in for if you continue reading. It's also a topic that I haven't experienced so much in literature, not that much. I think the book I thought about the most when I thought about my own writing and what kind of writer do I want to be is my favorite book of all time, which is Beloved by Toni Morrison, where there's also a dead child, right? And I remember when I read Beloved, and I must have been, 15 or 16 years old when I read this book, I could not imagine, I was like, how can any author write such a book with such a taboo, the mother kills her child. What is this, It really, and it meant a lot to me as somebody who was wanting to write herself and also wanted to capture my readers. But it also meant something to me as a potential mother. I always knew I wanted to have children. And then I thought to myself, what is this book telling me about, I'm going to be a mother probably of black children. As it happens, I am. And these children are going to make certain experiences. And what would I be prepared to do to try to save them from trauma or try to save them from harm? And this really did something with my head. So this experience is something like what I want to capture with Adas Ram to get readers to read it and to be like, wow, what's going on? Why is she doing that? My goodness, would I do that if I was in her shoes? This kind of thing. But the death of the mother had to do with, I think at some point while I was writing, it was important to me to recognize that mothers are not exclusively biological mothers. There are also people who enter into a mothering role and take on the role of a mother. And then there's also the question, I hear many young people say that they're not going to have children because the state of the world, and who can blame them? But what does it mean for the children that are already here? And can we not, as adults in this society, still take on a parenting role for the children already here, even if we haven't already given birth to them ourselves? So there's a conversation between the sisters, right, Ada and her sister Elle, where Elle is saying, I'm not going to have children. But some older women in the elder generation say to Elle, but you're going to be a mother nonetheless. When your sister gives birth to a child, you're going to be in a mothering role. And I just wanted to think about what that means. Yeah, even if your biological mother no longer lives, what kind of experience, what do you still experience of that parent, and also who filled in the void and how they can be given their respect too. Yeah.
You have given the role of narrator to inanimate objects such as a broom, a door knocker, a room, and a passport, a British one.
Yes.
Which is important.
Yeah, very important. Yeah.
And it seems to me that with this innovative approach, you have taken some kind of ontological twist where objects carry some kind of higher knowledge than aid us. So what was the purpose behind such a...
no one ever asked me about the object.
Innovation. Yeah.
So there's so many answers, and one thing that's really lovely about this book is that many people read it as part of their school studies or in universities. They even study it. They write PhDs about it. And then they tell me things that I didn't know, right? And one thing that somebody told me, which I think is a really good answer, is Adas Ram also, it's it's looking at people who have been marginalized, right? You're not typically going to get history told from the perspective of women who are, actually women in concentration camps who were forced into prostitution were almost entirely written out of history. Many people didn't know that they existed, and I didn't read about them from any literature. I read about fiction literature. I read about them in 2 or 3 non-fiction books, and it was very hard at the time when they were still alive for them to tell their stories, and this kind of thing. So this perspective of marginalizing certain stories was something that I wanted to take very seriously, and there is something about people who are marginalized where they kind of become objects, They don't have agency, or they're not seen to have agency. They seem to be just, I don't know, in the current discourse about migrants and asylum seekers, you'll rarely see them with a microphone in front of their face, right, on television. It's usually something where they're being talked about and they're kind of objectified or dehumanized. So there was some kind of twist there where these objects, which usually have no voice, literally, are now suddenly speaking and telling the story. Yeah.
And as the book was recently published, I think last week, so I assume not everyone had a chance to read it. So I suggest now we hear another excerpt from the book, this time in the form of non-personal narrator. Ana.
Med ogoljufanimi. 6:48. Zgodaj zjutraj Ada ni vedela še nič o nenavadnem razstavnem katalogu, kaj šele o tako prominentno predstavljeni zapestnici na njegovi 37. strani. Bil je brezveteren začetek dneva, temen in muhast. Nekaj, kar jo je v polsnu nekoliko vznemirjalo, čeprav ni vedela zakaj. Kljub temu pa sem imela jaz dober občutek. V obliki britanskega potnega lista sem imela določene lastnosti, o katerih sem lahko prej le sanjarila. Če bi imela Ada v 19. stoletju tolikšno svobodo gibanja, kot jo je uživala z mano, bi soproga takoj zapustila. O tem sem prepričana. Kaj sploh govorim, saj se z njim niti poročila ne bi. Moje misli je prekinil glasen Bog je prilebdel v obliki starejšega možaka. Dolga, plapolajoča oblačila, impozantna griva do ramen, sijoče oči, rahlo nagubana koža, mogočna brada. Vse belo. V oči bodeča belina. Še več beline, prav oslepljujoče. Kakšen kliše, sem vzkliknila. Kako dolgočasno. Opera, je rekel Bog in se sprehajal gor in dol, ob čemer si je večkrat pogladil brado. Kot da bi se poskušal nečesa domisliti. Kaj? Sem vprašala. Če bi imela obrvi, bi jih namrščila. Zmagu, se je veselil in zaploskal, ob čemer so mu dlani pri priči razpadle kot razbito steklo. Črepinje njegovih prstov so po lesenih tleh zažvenketale nežno kot blag poletni dež. Sem rekla, brez igre asociacij, prosim, sploh brez iger. Če že, bi rada govorila o zapestnici. Je zabrundal Bog. Kaj pa je z njo? Trudila sem se biti potrpežljiva in se ne razburjati. Do zdaj mi je šlo kar dobro. Bog se je zleknil po sobi in desno roko stegnil predse, kot da bi se hotel nečesa dotakniti s kazalcem. Njegova bela obleka je delovala na prsih nekoliko pretesna, pa tudi tako kratka je bila, da sem lahko videla njegova kolena. Ja, vse je povezano z njo, sem mu odvrnila. Zanimalo me je, kje je zapestnica in kdo naj bi jo dobil tokrat, pa tudi, ali bi Bog morda lahko oblekel kakšno drugo obleko. Zanimalo me je, če bom dobila še eno priložnost, tudi če predaja niti tokrat ne bo uspela. Kljub mojemu siceršnjemu optimizmu me je glodal dvom. Čutila sem, da določene stene pritiskajo name, še zlasti na mestu, kjer se oblikujejo misli. Le trudoma sem se lahko obrnila. Kar slabo mi je postalo, ko sem se vprašala, ali bom pri naslednji zanki dobila na izbiro le živalske karte. To bi me resno potrlo. Le kdo bi prostovoljno hotel biti žival? Žuželka, muha, ki jo mami Ašitej ubije v drugem poglavju. Ne, hvala. Dan je še mlad, je rekel Bog. Po nepotrebnem si delaš skrbi. Toda sem mu oporekala. Potem bo kar naenkrat neurje in Ada se bo spet razpustila v belini in na koncu mi, glej ga zlomka, spet ne bo zneslo. Saj vem, kako gre to. Leta 1848 se William za pesnice sploh ni pritaknil. Bog je skomignil z rameni. Ja. Ja? Ja. Kaj ti bo potem še 100 priložnosti? Kako naj ti uspe, če pa niti ne veš, kaj je šlo narobe? Nekje na območju dojemanja so se mi zavrtela kolesca. Brenčala so in brnela. Se je Bog norčeval iz mene? Imel je težko določljiv izraz. Bil je kot mešanica z dolgočasenosti in čudenja. Mar ni jasno, kaj je šlo narobe? Sem rekla naposled. Bog je spet skomignil. Meni ne. Moja razdražljivost je popustila šele, ko se mu je na usta prikradel rahel nasmešek. Glej, sem mu rekla. V Londonu mi je res bedno spodletelo. Čista polomija, tako očitna, da sem bila na koncu sploh edina, ki je bilo žal za levjo glavo.
So all the Edas are connected to the story of bracelet, which somehow symbolize the violence and exploitation by colonial powers. And I found the question about ownership and belonging as somehow an important one. And especially thinking about repatriation of artifacts back to the countries of the origin. And I'm particularly interested in how you, in general, view the reduction and the change of the meaning that bracelet undergoes when it's placed on the European soil, like it changed its meaning. And in the end, like, you know, it ends in collection catalog and it's somehow stripped away from its initial meaning.
That's true.
Right.
I think it says something like it's been displayed on loan from the man who it belonged to. It's just an image in a catalogue, and then it says 15th century West Africa on loan from this man. And it's interesting. The trick that I use in that part of the novel is that scene is in the second half of the novel. And by the time the reader gets to the scene, they know the whole history. They know what's happened with this bracelet and how it's moved through time and how it got to be where it is. More or less, there are gaps, but that's how history is at the moment. But when the main character, Ada, sees this catalogue and sees the image of the bracelet in the catalogue, she says, how comes that this bracelet from West Africa is being displayed in Berlin? What's that all about? And then there is also a discussion with this elder women about whether they'll go and see this bracelet that's on display in the museum. And the women say, no, why should we go? Why should we pay to see something that belongs to us? Meaning belongs to our culture, our people. It's been stolen from us and put on display. And the reason I wrote it that way was because I've already said in 2019 I was writing about the themes that came up in that year. Another one of the themes, apart from Brexit, was the whole theme about a new museum that was being erected in Berlin and was due to be opened in 2019, called the Humboldt Forum. And there was a discussion about some of the artifacts and art that was supposed to be being displayed, because a specific example is something called the Benin bronzes, which comes from an area in West Africa, which is now currently known as Nigeria. The Benin bronzes at the time in 2019 were, I think they were in storage in many of them. And this new museum was due to open, and they wanted to display the bronzes. And there was a huge argument about it, like lots of protests, because people were saying these bronzes came to Europe and came to Germany in unclean circumstances. You know, they were basically stolen violently from the kingdom in the... I always forget the exact year, but I think it was in the 19th century. They were stolen by the British, taken to London. Some of them are displayed in the British Museum. Some of them were sold around the world. You'll find them also in the United States. And some of them ended up in Germany. And these stolen artifacts should be sent back to the country of origin. And while that argument was going on, I was writing my book, and I was supposed to be capturing themes of that year. So I included the storyline of the bracelet, which is in a catalogue in 2019. But like I said, the reader knows more than the figures. When reader gets there, the reader knows that this bracelet was first in 15th century West Africa, and it had a very important significance. It's a fertility bracelet, and it was important that this bracelet stayed within the community so it could be passed from woman to woman to help them to give birth and become pregnant and then carry on their pregnancy to full term. Ada was supposed to keep this bracelet, but somehow it's stolen from her and ends up in Portugal. And this scene is described, and then somehow it disappears from Portugal, ends up in London, and then somehow it disappears from London and ends up in Germany. And this is just telling the story of African history, actually, that it sort of comes and goes, and people don't really know why there are so many gaps. And that's because many of the histories have been deliberately destroyed, and we can't quite navigate what actually, or reconstruct what actually happened. In any case, this bracelet is intended to show that in a very deliberate way. And I made also, if I may continue, I made a deliberate decision at the end of the book. It ends with the birth of a child, but it does not end with the bracelet being returned to West Africa, because I felt like the struggle for African peoples to have their history recognized at all in the first place, and then also to be respected and perhaps returned to the countries of origin, these historical artifacts, that is a struggle that goes over centuries. That's not gonna fit neatly into 300 pages. So I didn't want to end that part of the story as a happy end. But do you know, when I handed in the manuscript of the book at the end of, I think it was at the end of 2020, we found out like a few days later that the Humboldt Forum had decided to return the Benin bronzes. And I was like, oh, my book is a little bit wrong now, but I still left it like that.
Okay. Yeah, there is still a lot to return.
There's still a lot to return,
private. There is a lot in private collections that are unknown to us. But however, I think we have already talked enough about book, and there are a lot of spoilers. But let's touch the question of the language. So Ada's Realm is written in German, right? And you, as I said in the beginning, you developed a certain attachment to German language in your teenage years. And I think it's your second or third language, actually. I
can talk about why I can't answer that question so easily.
Okay.
It's a difficult question to answer because actually I had a very weird experience when I was growing up. I was born and raised in London. So my parents were both from Ghana, and they spoke Ga with each other. One of the many, many languages of Ghana is Ga. So I definitely, I think I spoke English at home, but I also understood Ga. When I was 3 years old, my sister was 2, my brother was 1. We all moved to Ghana, and I know for a fact that I would have spoken Ga there. And I spoke it fluently with my cousins. I have a memory of playing with my cousins and we're speaking Ga. And then when I came back to England when I was 5, I started school and I remember I couldn't speak English. So I must have forgotten how to speak English, right? Moved to Ghana, learnt Ga. But, you know, I forgot how to speak Ga when I came to England. And the reason that happened was to do with a very typical, people who come from different African countries and Caribbean countries want the very best education for their children, right? And one of the things they're told is, don't speak your foreign business. Don't speak your foreign nonsense with your children. Speak English, because that's the language that's speaking. So my parents spoke English to us at home, which meant that I lost access to their first language. So I have this... I don't know whether German is a second or third language for that reason, if you know what I mean. I learned German then in school, and
But now you're a writer.
I'm now a writer.
So you write in German language, and how do you manage it?
How do I manage to write in German?
Because I feel like in order to write, you need to have some emotional attachment, right?
To the language. Oh, I do have an emotion.
You have it. Yeah.
I definitely have an emotional attachment to the language. No, I understand your question. I think I'd like to... I think there's something in the question, and it's very understandable, that somehow assumes that if you're going to write something in a language, then you have to be really, really, really good at that language, right? And I guess you do have to have reached a certain level, but it was never my aim to write in German and to be, let me say that the other way around. People who read my book in German and are themselves German speakers who've spoken German since birth will definitely recognize that I don't write German in the same way. I definitely write in a way that you can tell, not because of mistakes, just the wordplay I use, the kind of things that I find funny and make a joke about, or the storyline in a way. You can definitely tell that this is somebody who's writing, who has learnt German in later life. And that, for me, is important. That's part of the storytelling. I'm trying to say with the book, people like me also belong. People like me also have stories to tell. And those stories can also belong to German literature. But I would also like to highlight the work of one other author who I admire a lot. And his name is Thomas Gardi, and he writes, his German is not polished, like the way that my German has been corrected and the commas are in the right place, hopefully. Thomas Gardi, actually that's not that funny, because in the first edition there are loads of mistakes, so don't, but Thomas Gardi writes deliberately. In fact, his German language is broken German. His first novel is called Broken German, and it's a deliberate statement on aspect of his identity. He's a writer who's from Israel, and the story is telling us, it's kind of making very transparent the fact that the reason why his German is broken is because his family lived in Germany during the time of the Nazi genocide on Jewish peoples, and his family were part of those who had to flee. But if he had not had to flee, then his German wouldn't be broken. So that was like really an important aspect of the storytelling. And the reason I mention that is to say, I think I would encourage anybody who's learning any language to take that language and run with it, to do, to express yourself in that language, because that's, to me, the whole point of language. It's a means to an end. We use language to communicate with each other. And if you make a mistake and if you forget one of the vocabularies, it doesn't matter, because normally you're speaking from your heart about important matters, and that's really the most important thing. And it's a development as well. You get better and better at it. So you might write something and it's not that good, but then you revise it and then you'll work on it, and maybe you'll discuss it with somebody, and then you get feedback, and basically that's the process of writing Adas Raum was like that. Just lots and lots of rewriting and talking and writing again.
Yeah, generally we oftentimes hear that once a writer finishes a book, he or she has no longer any influence over how it is understood by the readers. And given that your book references some lesser-known historical contexts, such as, let's say, prehistorical, pre-colonial Africa or Ada Lovelace, which are typically not included in European and also not Slovenian historical canons and school curriculums, I'm curious, how do you view the possibility that your writing might be accepted within interpretably limited frameworks?
Yeah, that's a problem.
That's the problem, yeah.
What can you do about that? Yeah, that's a real problem. I have a problem because if you ask me without that very interesting background to the question, if you just say, okay, you're a writer, you're writing a book, I would say the book actually happens between the pages and the reader. Yeah. So it's a slightly different book, actually, depending on who reads it. That's my honest answer. The kind of the writer is dead answer, which is not a nice thing to say. But of course, I intend something. You know, I worked very hard to try to get this sentence to sound this exact way and get that rhyme in there and remind the reader that this happened on page 1 and this. Of course, I have an intention. And when readers tell me that they've understood my intention, then that's great. And when readers tell me I had no idea what was going on, then that's very bad, right? So if I read reviews of the book where I have the feeling, oh, something got in the way of their understanding what I was trying to say, I do feel sad about it. But I still think, on balance, that's okay too. And I think sometimes I've experienced that I've read something or I've watched a film. That happens more often. I've watched a film when I was younger, and then 20 years pass and I watch the film again and it's a completely different film, you know. And I think that can happen with a book too. And I think I should let go, really. It's going to happen. People are going to interpret it how they interpret it, and that's okay. Yeah.
So could you speak now a little bit about your activism and collaboration with Black German community, especially considering that German society, similarly like Slovenian, consider itself as predominantly white, right? And how do you place, I mean, like, what is your activism about? I mean, like, you were very vocal about racism in literature, discriminatory language. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can try. Maybe I'll start with something. The most recent project, my most recent project is to collaborate with a large cultural institution in Germany. It's called the Ruhrfestspiele in Recklinghausen. And for the last 3 years, so 2022, 2023 and 2024, we jointly curated a literature festival of Black German language literature. And my thinking behind that was, if you check the books that are published in Germany, I mean, the ones that are published by the major publishing houses that are publishing novels, it's before Ada's Raum was published, there were very few. I think the first one in living memory was the book Brüder by Jackie Tolmay in 2019. That's my memory. That seemed to be like the first book written by a Black German, published in German language in a major publishing house. I think I'm correct in that. Then the next book that was published was the year after, which was Tausend Serpentinenangst by Olivia Wenzel. And then Ada's Raum was the third one. And I found that very unsatisfactory, to be honest. I was like, that doesn't seem right, especially because I come from a movement, this Black German movement, which depends on literature, actually. People read a lot. They read a lot of literature from other contexts, necessarily, because most of the novels that they're accessing were written in English, but these novels were often lifesavers because they might be growing up as the only Black German in their family, the only Black person in a village or city. So they needed books to access stories and people, you know, make connections to people who were having experiences similar to them. Then they were also reading poetry. So Black Germans like Mai Ayim were writing poetry which was really reflecting the Black German experience and giving vocabulary to things that Black Germans were experiencing. And I just knew that there were a lot of talented people who were also writing and didn't have access to a literary agent like I did, didn't have access to a publishing house like S. Fisher. So my idea with the Literature Festival was to try to bring together agents and literary representatives of the publishers and people who are writing and say, look, mingle. So I would invite, so 2 years, 2022 and 2024, we had a 3-day, 4-day festival where 6 authors who were previously not published or only published in small publishing houses or self-publishing were encouraged to write a short story, a little bit like with the Ingeborg-Bachmann-Preises. They wrote a short story, and then these stories were read out on stage, and then the stories were analysed and discussed by a jury who were also all black people who live and work in German, using German as their working language, and are literature critics. And the middle festival in 2023, we had a one-evening festival where we looked at literature written by black Germans or by black people whose work had been translated into German. And this was also discussed by a jury of black people, black literature critics. And the idea being that, again, it's not explicitly about black people being, oh, what a shame they're experiencing racism and that's all they write about, but also bringing out the fact that they write about many, many different things, as everybody does, that they perhaps use codes. And so one of the things that came out in the discussion, for example, which was really interesting, was that a lot of the authors wrote about hair, and hair is highly symbolic. Hair can, if you have hair that's crafted in a certain way, it can teach you something about where a person comes from or what cultural background they have, or even, for example, in times of enslavement, hair could be braided in such a way to make maps so people knew how to escape, or seeds were embedded into their hair so that they could have something to start farming with when they reached the place what they were running to. This kind of thing came out in the stories. Or one of the themes was fathers, that people thought a lot about fathers, absent fathers maybe, or how important fathers were for their own identity. This kind of thing had space to be discussed, which normally wouldn't be discussed, unfortunately, because, literature written by black Germans is still so rare. So that was one of the things that I tried to use my position as a public figure to try and encourage more people to come to stage. And one of the people who took part in that first competition has now published her book. She got a book contract. I'm so excited about it. And her book is called Adikou, Adikou. Her name is Raphael Red. And actually, she wrote her book in French originally, and it's been translated into German, but she speaks fluent German, French, and English. And she's very talented and very beautiful. And yes, it's a great book too.
Okay, I hope the Slovene publishers also heard
Yes,
this.
honestly, it's a wonderful book. Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe this is going to be my last question. I'm not sure, before we give a space to the audience. So this year, slogan of the Fabula festivals is distorted realities. And in the perspective of your book, this naturally leads me to reflect on the idea of a single dominant reality, and where all other realities are seen as somehow distorted. And, there is some kind of hierarchy of knowledge and experience which answer the main question, like who matters and who is heard and who is silenced. And could you speak a little bit more about that, on the pluralism of knowledge and how you incorporated it not only in your writing but also in your work, right?
Yeah.
Why is it important to you?
Pluralism of knowledge. Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's very easy to, especially in these times where most of us are carrying a computer around in our pocket. Very easy to quickly look up an answer, and then that will be it. You don't need to do any further research. I've been experimenting with ChatGPT, not for my writing. I still write myself, but I every now and then turn to ChatGPT for advice, and it's very fascinating to me that ChatGPT. The way it works, it sounds like it's giving you the correct answer, and that, you feel very understood, and, you've got this partner who's explaining things to you, and it's really nice. It's very nice to use ChatGPT sometimes. Anyway, I digress. What I'm trying to say is, when you do that, when you watch a single Instagram story, or you watch a TikTok video, or you access a short YouTube clip, you have the feeling perhaps that you've understood the key points, and it's very easy then to form an opinion, and then that becomes the basis on which you act or don't act. And I think the challenge is now, with this computer in our pockets, to not rely on that only as a source of knowledge, but to also read something else, read a newspaper, read a book, watch the news, watch a few different news outlets. I've been really interested I've been following the news on what's going on in the United States, like many of us have. And I read the German news, and I read the US news, and I read the UK news. And it's really baffling to me how different they are, actually. And I could imagine that in Slovenian it's also different. And that's a challenge, to not be overwhelmed by that, but to view that as an opportunity. And also, I think it seems to me really important for all of us to keep talking to other people, because there's a lot of people who won't make the effort to do all this reading. And then the only way that they're going to access these alternative perspectives is if they're talking to someone who they maybe love and respect, who will gently point them in a new direction, say, well, have you considered this? Or maybe you should think about this part. And I think that, we've been relying, or I've been relying a lot on quick email, quick voice message. But I think maybe that's not enough anymore. And so writing a book like Ada's Room was about me thinking through also, one challenge when you're an author is to write many different figures who all think differently. I find that so fascinating how other authors do it, how they manage to create such different figures who get into conflict with each other. That was something that I liked to explore. And when literature works well, you'll have figures that are completely different and who are in conflict, but the reader can understand both sides. I think that's the most exciting part to me. You might not agree with everything, but you can kind of understand how they came up with that. And that's the chance that literature provides us, that is not so easily replicated with other forms. I was wondering if film can do it. Film does it to a certain extent, but I think film also, in a way, presents you with, everything all together, the sound and the images, and that you have that all together. At least mainstream, very popular films give you all the information at once. And those forms of art that allow you to take a step back and reflect and think and fill in the gaps for yourself. Poetry often does that. I think they are giving us a chance in these times where everybody wants to have the answer yesterday.
Thank you, Sharon. I think I suggest we should give the audience some space, and maybe we should take a few questions.
Happily.
Depends on the time, so please, raise the hand.
You have to put your glasses.
Yeah, I need to put my glasses now. And is there any question or comment?
There's a question. We need a bit more light, I'm afraid.
Thank you both for this really interesting and thought-provoking conversation. I have been wondering, how free do you feel in your writing and activism in Germany right now? And I'm asking because I've read you had a literary award, the Peter Weiss Prize, suspended from what I've read. And of course, you weren't the only writer this sort of thing has happened to. I'm thinking of the brilliant Adina Shibli as well at about the same time. And the details, of course, were different, but the general reasons were the same. And in your case specifically, the issue was that you signed an Artists for Palestine petition, I think. So in this context, how do you feel about, how free do you feel as a writer and as a public
Thank you for that question. If it's okay, I won't talk about artists for Palestine, and I won't go into that part because I'd like not to try to do a quick answer on it. It's too complicated for that. But I would like to try to talk about my feeling as an artist working at this moment in time where things are so complex. Is that okay? So it is very difficult, and I was actually working on a different project when that happened. I wanted to write a project which was still not a historical project, but it was going to be based in 1972, simply because that's the year I was born. That's the only reason. But 1972 in Germany, and what I wanted to do was to, through two figures who were married to each other, tell a story about Black German history. So the man would be an African-American soldier or a veteran who came to Germany the first time in the 30s and was actually part of the Olympic team where Jesse Owens was running that story. Time he came to Germany, and then he came to Germany again at the end of 45 as part of the people who were stationed in Germany who were, helping Germans to become democratic and such. And this man, this African-American, actually loved Germany, which is what I understood was the historical experience of many African-Americans that in the US, they were experiencing segregation and they were being treated terribly. And actually in the army, they were also segregated. But when they were living in Germany, that very, very, on the face racism to Black people wasn't their experience. So he wanted to stay in Germany. When he met his wife, got married, he was like, I'm good. I'm staying here. I'm not going back to that place. And then his wife is an Afro-German whose father comes from Cameroon. And Cameroon used to be a German colony. So her father was actually arrested and put in a concentration camp and died there. And she went into hiding. So her thing was, I'm going to marry a US American and get the hell out of here. And that, of course, didn't happen. So I wanted to tell that story. Now, in 1972, there was one of the things that was a major shake-up was there was the Olympics again in Germany. And that was the year that the Israeli team, was kidnapped and murdered, right? So that was going to be part of the story. And I suddenly found that I just didn't feel free to write that story anymore. And I was very lucky because I had a lot of support from my publishers during that time. And I explained it to them. I said, this is what I want to do, but I can't do that right now. I can't take the word Israel into my mouth right now. So I asked them if they would let me put that project on ice, and I started a new project. So that's, to answer your question, yes, it's very difficult. But what I would also like to say is some of the writers I admire most have been writing through times where there were real dictatorships and real censorship. And they found a way. And I think that there's a quote that's I use on a website where I write a newsletter, which is comes from an author called Edwidge Danticat. She's from Haiti, you know her. And she says, create dangerously. Create dangerously because someday, sometime, someone might risk their life to read your writing. And that really carries me a lot. I don't feel like I have the right to live comfortably in times when people are actually, really in danger. It's my job as a writer to try to somehow reflect that. So although it's terrible that happened, it was also important, I think. It made me realize I'd realized it. I'd seen what was going on with Adina Shibli and so on, but it's something completely different if you experience it yourself. And it just kind of woke me up in a new way and made me more determined than ever to find a way to keep creating, but find my way using subversive storylines or something like that. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much. And I do hope we'll be eventually able to read the book that you
we will. Thank you.
Is there any question? Any other question or comment? Maybe? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Go on, please.
Thank you for the beautiful talk. And I have one question. I heard that you spent 5 years writing this book, and I also enjoy journaling and writing. It's also one sort of my way to process my thoughts and also understand the things that are going in my life and in the world. And also, it's another way to fight for myself, to figure out things in my life. And in that sense, I was curious how the journey of your writing of this book made you into a different person. Because I think the writing, not only the book that the writer creates gives something to the readers, but it also gives and transforms the author itself through the time that you work on the book. I guess you feel a different person in terms of like you before writing this book, you as a person who's working on this book, and you after writing this book.
Thank you for that question. I haven't thought about that before. I have to think. It definitely changed me. Definitely. I suffered a lot while I was writing this book. I don't know if anybody writes. Writing can be terrible, especially when you're supposed to be finished 2 years ago. I don't recommend that at all. I think I also underestimated what it would mean to write this book in German. And I don't only mean that the language didn't always give me what I needed to be able to express myself. Sometimes it was like that, but sometimes it was the doubt that came up. So if you, or when I speak German, I am acutely aware that I come across as slightly younger and slightly more flippant and a little bit less intelligent. If I come across as intelligent at all, in German I come across as less intelligent. And writing this book and knowing that people were going to read it made me feel insecure in a way that I hadn't reckoned with, you know? So the journey of writing involved a lot of self-doubt and wondering if I should continue, if I should switch languages. I am so happy that I continued and I finished it and wrote it in German, because that's, like I said before, is an important part of the story that I did that. But I suppose the other thing that I found difficult about writing, and I don't mean to blame anybody for this, but it's simply a fact that I live in a context where nobody else that I am close to in my family or my close circle of friends, nobody else writes, right? So there's this kind of lack of understanding of what it means for me to be sitting down and trying to break my head to create these characters and these plots. It looks so much easier. You know, my youngest son was something like 7 and 8 when I was coming to the end of writing, and he just saw me sitting in front of the computer, wondering why I was always telling him to get off the computer, you know? So there was something very hard about me writing in that context as well, like fighting to be taken seriously by my family. And then when I finished, and also I lost a lot of hair because I kept pulling my hair out. So when I finished writing, I did feel like I'd achieved something, but at the same time, there was a kind of loss, you know, because I had to let go. I had to say, okay, that's that part of the process done now. I have no more control over what anyone's going to say about it. And also, I feel like the book isn't finished, not because it should have been longer. I don't think it should be longer, but I feel like if I had more time, I would have kept on going. I would have kept on adding another twist here and, you know, refining that word there. There's things that I'm not so happy about. And I wonder now if any writer ever feels that their book is finished, or if published books are just, they reached the deadline and they had to hand it in, and someone fought for them to get it off of their laptop. So it changed me, I guess, in a way, because I felt much more pragmatic afterwards. So I used to see writing as a very it is still a very prestigious piece of work, but I had, let's say, rose-colored glasses about the whole project. I thought, you would sit down, the words would flow from your fingertips, and then it would be finished. And, you'd write it, and as you write it, it turns into a printed book. And it's not like that. And maybe it's good I didn't know that beforehand. Writing my second book now is in some ways, much more a matter of, okay, this is what you've just got to get through the pain. And then at the end, it will be fine. Yeah.
Okay. Is there any other question? Now I have my eyeglasses on. So.
Yeah. There was a second question.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, go on, please.
Thank you. Just because you mentioned thinking about switching languages during the process, how did you feel when you came to the end of the process and then there was somebody else who translated your book into English, which is actually your first language? So how did you feel about that, and how involved were you in the process?
Yeah, I was super grateful that someone else translated it. Oh my God. I fought for 5 years to get the book out of my head in the first place, and now I'm going to go through the whole thing again in English? No. And I think translating, by the way, big up to the translator. Where are you, by the way, the translator? Here. Thank you so much. Yeah. I think translating is magic, a work of magic, and I believe, I would claim that I cannot translate in any case, but I also think if I had tried to translate Ada's Realm, I would have ended up writing a new book. That's what would have happened, and then I would have been highly dissatisfied with the German original. I would have rewritten that, and then I would have gone back to the translation. You know what I'm saying? I think it's good that I let go of that. The person who was chosen to translate Ada's Realm into English, John Chopolitzi, is an amazing person. He's very generous, and he really he took it so seriously and really worked. So he invited me to read drafts and to comment on them, and exactly what I just described happened. I said, you could use this word, or you could use that word. I might use that word, but it's entirely up to you. It drove him crazy. So in the end, I just thought, John, you get on with it. It's your translation. It's your interpretation of what I did in German. And he did a really, really good job, I think. He also had to then, and I feel very bad about that, he had to work with 2 different editing teams. So he did one translation, and then he worked with the US-American editors for the US edition and the UK. It was a lot. And there were very different decisions taken for the edition, so he works really hard on it, yeah.
Okay, so thank you. I think the organizers told me we should have 1 hour, and then we agree on 1 hour and 10 minutes. I think we are even past that. So I suggest we somehow finish here.
Yes.
I don't have a proper conclusion or closure words. So I just want to sincerely thank you, and thank you, the audience. And please read the book. It's really fantastic. And Sharon will also now sign the copies, right?
Yes.
And first one will be mine. So
yes.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.